This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stefan Schmelz, Munich. Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting One's Reason and of Seeking by René Descartes, Part 1. Prefatory Note by the author. If this discourse appear too long to be read at once, it may be divided into 6 parts, and in the first will be found various considerations touching the sciences, in the second the principal rules of the method which the author has discovered, in the third certain of the rules of morals which he has deducted from this method, in the fourth the reasonings by which he establishes the existence of God and of the human soul, which are the foundations of his metaphysic, in the fifth the order of the physical questions which he has investigated, and, in particular, the explication of the motion of the heart and of some other difficulties pertaining to medicine, as also the difference between the soul of man and that of the brutes. And in the last, what the author believes to be required in order to greater advancement in the investigation of nature than has yet been made, with the reasons that have induced him to write. Part 1. Good sense is, of all things among men, the most equally distributed, for everyone thinks himself so abundantly provided with it, that those even who are the most difficult to satisfy in everything else do not usually desire a larger measure of this quality than they already possess. And in this it is not likely that all are mistaken. The conviction is rather to be held as testifying that the power of judging aright and of distinguishing truth from error, which is probably what is called good sense or reason, is by nature equal in all men, and that the diversity of our opinions consequently does not arise from some being endowed with a larger share of reason than others, but solely from this that we conduct our thoughts along different ways, and do not fix our attention on the same objects. For to be possessed of a vigorous mind is not enough. The prime requisite is rightly to apply it. The greatest minds, as they are capable of the highest excellences, are open likewise to the greatest aberrations, and those who travel very slowly may yet make far greater progress, provided they keep always to the straight road, than those who, while they run, forsake it. For myself, I have never fancied my mind to be in any respect more perfect than those of the generality. On the contrary, I have often wished that I were equal to some others in promptitude of thought, or in clearness and distinctness of imagination, or in fullness and readiness of memory. And besides these, I know of no other qualities that contribute to the perfection of the mind. For as to the reason or sense, inasmuch as it is that alone which constitutes us men and distinguishes us from the brutes, I am disposed to believe that it is to be found complete in each individual. And on this point to adopt the common opinion of philosophers, who say that the difference of greater and less holds only among the accidents, and not among the forms of natures of individuals of the same species. I will not hesitate, however, to avow my belief that it has been my singular good fortune to have very early in life fallen in with certain tracks which have conducted me to considerations and maxims of which I have formed a method that gives me the means, as I think, of gradually augmenting my knowledge, and of raising it by little and little to the highest point which the mediocrity of my talents and the brief duration of my life will permit me to reach. For I have already reaped from it such fruits that, although I have been accustomed to think lowly enough of myself, and although when I look with the eye of a philosopher at the varied courses and pursuits of mankind at large, I find scarcely one which does not appear in vain and useless, I nevertheless derive the highest satisfaction from the progress I conceive myself to have already made in the search after truth, and cannot help entertaining such expectations of the future as to believe that if, among the occupations of men as men, there is any one really excellent and important, it is that which I have chosen. After all, it is possible I may be mistaken, and it is but a little copper and glass, perhaps, that I take for gold and diamonds. I know how very liable we are to delusion in what relates to ourselves, and also how much the judgments of our friends are to be suspected when given in our favor. But I shall endeavor in this discourse to describe the paths I have followed, and to delineate my life as in a picture, in order that each one may also be able to judge of them for himself, and that in the general opinion entertained of them, as gathered from current report, I myself may have a new help towards instruction to be added to those I have been in the habit of employing. My present design, then, is not to teach the method which each ought to follow for the right conduct of his reason, but solely to describe the way in which I have endeavored to conduct my own. They who set themselves to give precepts must of course regard themselves as possessed of greater skill than those to whom they prescribe. And if they err in the slightest particular, they subject themselves to censure. But as this tract is put forth merely as a history, or if you will as a tale, in which, amid some examples worthy of imitation, there will be found perhaps as many more which it were advisable not to follow, I hope it will prove useful to some without being hurtful to any, and that my openness will find some favor with all. From my childhood I have been familiar with letters, and as I was given to believe that by their help a clear and certain knowledge of all that is useful in life might be acquired, I was ardently desirous of instruction. But as soon as I had finished the entire course of study, at the close of which it is customary to be admitted into the order of the learned, I completely changed my opinion. For I found myself involved in so many doubts and errors that I was convinced I had advanced no farther in all my attempts at learning than the discovery at every turn of my own ignorance. And yet I was studying in one of the most celebrated schools in Europe, in which I thought there must be learned men, if such were anywhere to be found. I had been taught all that others learned there, and not contented with the sciences actually taught us, I had in addition read all the books that had fallen into my hands, treating of such branches as are esteemed the most curious and rare. I knew the judgment which others had formed of me, and I did not find that I was considered inferior to my fellows, although there were among them some who were already marked out to fill the places of our instructors. And in fine, our age appeared to me as flourishing and as fertile in powerful minds as any preceding one. I was thus led to take the liberty of judging of all other men by myself, and of concluding that there was no science in existence that was of such a nature as I had previously been given to believe. I still continued, however, to hold in esteem the studies of the schools. I was aware that the languages taught in them are necessary to the understanding of the writings of the ancients, that the grace of fable stirs the mind, that the memorable deeds of history elevate it, and, if read with discretion, aid in forming the judgment, that the perusal of all excellent books is, as it were, to interview with the noblest men of past ages who have written them, and even a studied interview in which are discovered to us only their choicest thoughts, that eloquence has incomparable force and beauty, that poesy has its ravishing graces and delights, that in the mathematics there are many refined discoveries eminently suited to gratify the inquisitive, as well as further all the arts and lessen the labor of man, that numerous highly useful precepts and exhortations to virtue are contained in treatises on morals, that theology points out the path to heaven, that philosophy affords the means of discoursing with an appearance of truth on all matters, and commands the admiration of the more simple, that jurisprudence, medicine, and the other sciences secure for their cultivators honours and riches, and, in fine, that it is useful to bestow some attention upon all, even upon those abounding the most in superstition and error, that we may be in a position to determine their real value, and guard against being deceived. But I believed that I had already given sufficient time to languages, and likewise to the reading of the writings of the ancients, to their histories and fables. For to hold converse with those of other ages and to travel are almost the same thing. It is useful to know something of the manners of different nations, that we may be enabled to form a more correct judgment regarding our own, and be prevented from thinking that everything contrary to our customs is ridiculous and irrational, a conclusion usually come to by those whose experience has been limited to their own country. On the other hand, when too much time is occupied in travelling, we become strangers to our native country, and the over-curious in the customs of the past are generally ignorant of those of the present. Besides, fictitious narratives lead us to imagine the possibility of many events that are impossible, and even the most faithful histories, if they do not wholly misrepresent matters or exaggerate their importance to render the account of them more worthy of perusal, omit, at least almost always, the meanest and least striking of the attendant circumstances. Hence, it happens that the remainder does not represent the truth, and that such as regulate their conduct by examples drawn from this source are apt to fall into the extravagances of the knight-errants of romance, and to entertain projects that exceed their powers. I esteemed eloquence highly, and was in raptures with poesy, but I thought that both were gifts of nature rather than fruits of study. Those in whom the faculty of reason is predominant, and who most skilfully dispose their thoughts with a view to render them clear and intelligible, are always the best able to persuade others of the truth of what they lay down, though they should speak only in the language of Lower Brittany, and be wholly ignorant of the rules of rhetoric. And those whose minds are stored with the most agreeable fancies, and who can give expression to them with the greatest embellishment and harmony, are still the best poets, though unacquainted with the art of poetry. I was especially delighted with the mathematics on account of the certitude and evidence of their reasonings, but I had not as yet a precise knowledge of their true use, and thinking that they but contributed to the advancement of the mechanical arts, I was astonished that foundations so strong and solid should have had no loftier superstructure reared on them. On the other hand, I compared the disquisitions of the ancient moralists to very towering and magnificent palaces with no better foundation than sand and mud. They laud the virtues very highly, and exhibit them as estimable far above anything on earth. But they give us no adequate criterion of virtue, and frequently that which they designate with so fine a name is but apathy, or pride, or despair, or parricide. I revered our theology, and aspired as much as anyone to reach heaven, but being given assuredly to understand that the way is not less open to the most ignorant than to the most learned, and that the revealed truths which lead to heaven are above our comprehension, I did not presume to subject them to the impotency of my reason, and I thought that in order competently to undertake the examination there was need of some special help from heaven, and of being more than man. Of philosophy I will say nothing, except that when I saw that it had been cultivated for many ages by the most distinguished men, and that yet there is not a single matter within its sphere which is not still in dispute, and nothing, therefore, which is above doubt, I did not presume to anticipate that my success would be greater in it than that of others. And further, when I considered the number of conflicting opinions touching a single matter that may be upheld by learned men, while there can be but one true, I reckoned as well-nigh false all that was only probable. As to the other sciences, inasmuch as these borrow their principles from philosophy, I judged that no solid superstructures could be reared on foundations so infirm, and neither the honour nor the gain held out by them was sufficient to determine me to their cultivation. For I was not, thank heaven, in a condition which compelled me to make merchandise of science for the bettering of my fortune, and though I might not profess to scorn glory as a cynic, I yet made very slight account of that honour which I hoped to acquire only through fictitious titles. And, in fine, of false sciences I thought I knew the worth sufficiently to escape being deceived by the professions of an alchemist, the predictions of an astrologer, the impostures of a magician, or by the artifices and boasting of any of those who profess to know things of which they are ignorant. For these reasons, as soon as my age permitted me to pass from under the control of my instructors, I entirely abandoned the study of letters, and resolved no longer to seek any other science than the knowledge of myself, or of the great book of the world. I spent the remainder of my youth in travelling, in visiting courts and armies, in holding intercourse with men of different dispositions and ranks, in collecting varied experience, in proving myself in the different situations into which fortune threw me, and, above all, in making such reflection on the matter of my experience as to secure my improvement. For it occurred to me that I should find much more truth in the reasonings of each individual with reference to the affairs in which he is personally interested, and the issue of which must presently punish him if he has judged amiss, than in those conducted by a man of letters in his study, regarding speculative matters that are of no practical moment, and followed by no consequences to himself, farther, perhaps, than that they foster his vanity the better, the more remote they are from common sense, requiring, as they must in this case, the exercise of greater ingenuity and art to render them probable. In addition, I had always a most earnest desire to know how to distinguish the true from the false, in order that I might be able clearly to discriminate the right path in life, and proceed in it with confidence. It is true that, while busied only in considering the manners of other men, I found here, too, scarce any ground for settled conviction, and remarked hardly less contradiction among them than in the opinions of the philosophers, so that the greatest advantage I derived from the study consisted in this, that, observing many things which, however extravagant and ridiculous to our apprehension, are yet by common consent received and approved by other great nations, I learned to entertain, too, decided a belief in regard to nothing of the truth of which I had been persuaded merely by example and custom, and thus I gradually extricated myself from many errors powerful enough to darken our natural intelligence, and incapacitate us in great measure from listening to reason. But after I had been occupied several years in thus studying the book of the world, and in essaying to gather some experience, I at length resolved to make myself an object of study, and to employ all the powers of my mind in choosing the paths I ought to follow, an undertaking which was accompanied with greater success than it would have been had I never quitted my country or my books. End of part 1.
How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content.
Consideration is reduced to seek some other method which would compromise the advantages of the three and be exempt from the defects. As a multitude of laws often only have their justices, so that a state is best governed where, with few laws, they are rigidly administered. In like manner, instead of the great number of precepts of which logic is composed, I believe that the four following would prove perfectly sufficient for me, provided I took firm and unwavering resolution, never in single instance to fail in observing them. The first was never to accept anything for true which I did not clearly know to be such, that is to say, carefully to avoid precipitancy and prejudice, and compromise nothing more in my judgment than what was presented to my mind so clearly and distinctly as to exclude all ground of doubt. Second, to divide each of the difficulties under examination into as many parts as possible, and as may be necessary for its adequate solution. Third, to conduct my thoughts in such order that, by commencing with objects the simplest and easiest to know, I may descend by little and little, and as it were, step by step, to the knowledge of the more complex, assigning in thought a certain order even to those objects which in their own nature do not stand in relation of antecedents and sequence. And the last, in every case, to make enumeration so complete and review so general that I might be assured that nothing was omitted. The long chains of simple and easy reasonings by means of which the auditors are accustomed to reach the conclusions of their most difficult demonstrations had led me to imagine all things, to knowledge of which I am competent, are mutually connected in the same way, and that there is nothing so far removed from us as beyond our reach, or so hidden that we cannot discover it, provided only we abstain from accepting the false for the true, and always preserve in our thoughts the order necessary for the deduction of one truth from another. And I had little difficulty in determining the objects with which it was necessary to commence, for I was already persuaded that it must be the simplest and easiest to know, and considering that of all those who had hitherto sought truth in the sciences, the mathematicians alone had been able to find any demonstrations, that is, any certain evident reasons, I did not doubt but that such was the rule of their investigations. Resolved to commence, therefore, the examination of the simplest objects, not anticipating, however, from this any other advantage than that to be found in accustoming my mind to love and nourishment of truth, and to distaste for all such reasonings as were unsound. But I had no intention, on that account, of attempting to master all the particular sciences commonly denominated mathematics. But observing that, however different their objects, they all agree in considering only the various relations or proportions subsisting among subjects, I thought it best for my purpose to consider these proportions in the most general form possible, without referring them to any object in particular, except as such as would most facilitate knowledge of them, and without by any means restricting them to these, that afterwards I might thus be better able to apply them to every other class of objects to which they are legitimately applicable. Proceeding further, in order to understand these relations, I should sometimes have to consider them one by one, and sometimes only bear them in mind, or embrace them in aggregate. I thought that, in order better to consider them individually, I should view them as subsisting between straight lines, than which I could find no objects more simple, or capable of being more distinctly represented to my imagination and senses. And on the other hand, that in order to retain them in the memory or embrace an aggregate of many, I should express some certain characters, proof if possible. In this way, I believe that I could borrow all that was best both in geometric analysis and in algebra, and correct all the defects of the one by help of the other. And, in point of fact, accurate observance of these few precepts gave me, I take the liberty of saying, such ease in unraveling all the questions embraced in these two sciences, that in the 2 or 3 months I devoted to their examination, not only did I reach solutions of questions I formerly deemed exceedingly difficult, but even as regards questions of the solution, of which I continued ignorant, I was enabled, as it appeared to me, to determine the means whereby, and the extent to which, a solution was possible. Results attributable to the circumstance that I commenced with the simplest and most general truths, and that thus each truth has suffered as a rule available in discovery of subsequent ones. Nor in this past shall I appear too vain. If it be considered that, as the truth on any particular point is, one who ever apprehends the truth knows all that on that point can be known. The child, for example, who has been instructed in elements of arithmetic, and has made a particular addition, according to rule, may be assured that he has found the respect to the sum of the numbers before him, and that, in this instance, is within the reach of human genius. Now, in conclusion, the method which teaches adherence to the true order and exact enumeration of all the conditions of the things sought includes all that gives certitude to the rules of arithmetic. But chief ground of my satisfaction with this method was the assurance I had of thereby exercising my reason in all matters, if not with absolute perfection, at least with greatest attainable by me. Besides, I was conscious that by its use my mind was become gradually habituated to clearer and more distinct conceptions of its objects, and I hoped also, from not having restricted this method to any particular matter, to apply it to the difficulties of the other sciences, with not less success than those of algebra. I should not, however, on this account have ventured at once on the examination of all the difficulties of the sciences which presented themselves to me, for this would have been contrary to the more prescribed method. But observing the knowledge of such is dependent on principles borrowed from philosophy, in which I found nothing certain, I thought it necessary, first of all, to endeavor to establish its principles. And because I observed, besides, that an inquiry of this kind was of all others of the greatest moment, and one in which precipitancy and anticipation of judgment were most to be dreaded, I thought that I ought not to approach it till I had reached a more mature age, being at time but 23, and had first of all employed which I find preparation for the work, as well by eradicating from my mind all the erroneous opinions I had up to that moment accepted, as by amassing a variety of experience to afford materials for my reasonings, and by continually exercising myself in my chosen method, with a view to increased skill in its application. End of part 2.
This is LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Oppenheim. Discourse the method of rightly conducting one's reason and seeking by René Descartes, Part 3. And finally, as it is not enough, before commencing to rebuild a house in which we live, that we pull down the materials and build as provided, or that we engage in the work ourselves, according to a plan which we have beforehand, carefully drawn out, but, as it is likewise necessary, we be furnished with some other house in which we may live commodiously during the operations, so that I might not remain irresolute in my actions, while my reason compelled me to suspend my judgment, that I might not be prevented from living thenceforward in the greatest possible felicity. I formed a provisory code of morals, composed of 3 four maxims, with which I am desirous to make you acquainted. The first was to obey the laws and customs of my country, adhering firmly to the faith in which, by the grace of God, I had been educated from my childhood, and regulating my conduct in every other matter according to the most moderate opinion, and fast to move from extremes, which would happen to be adopted in practice with general consent of the most judicious of those among whom I might be living. For as I had, from that time, begun to hold my own opinions for naught, because of which to object them all to examination, I was convinced that I could not do better than follow in the meantime the opinions of the most judicious. And although there are some, perhaps among the Persians and Chinese, as judicious as among ourselves, expediency seemed to dictate that I should regulate my practice conformably to the opinions of those with whom I should have to live. And it appeared to me that, in order to ascertain the real opinions of such, I would rather to take cognizance of what they practice than of what they said, not only because, in the rush of our manners, they are few supposed to speak exactly as they believe, but also because very many are not aware of what it is that they really believe. For, as the act of mind by which a thing is believed is different from that by which we know that we believe it, the one act is often found without the other. Also, amid many opinions held in equal repute, it should always be the most moderate, as might for the reason that these are always the most convenient for practice, and probably the best, for all excess is generally vicious, and that, in the event of my falling into error, I might be less distant from the truth than if, having chosen one's extremes, it would turn out to be the other, which I ought to have adopted. And I place in class of extremes, especially all promises, of which somewhat of freedom is abridged, not that I disapprove of the laws which provide against the instability of man of feeble resolution, and what thought be accomplished in some good, from engagements by vows and contracts binding parties to persevere in it, or even, for the security of commerce, sanction similar engagements where the purpose thought be realized is indifferent. But because I did not find anything on earth that was wholly superior to change, and because for myself in particular, I hoped gradually to perfect my judgments, and not to suffer them to deteriorate, I would have deemed a great sin against good sense, if, for the reason that I approve of something at a particular time, and therefore bound myself to hold it for good at a subsequent time, and perhaps had ceased to be so, or I had ceased to esteem it such. My second maxim was to be as firm and resolute in my actions as I was able, and not to adhere less steadfastly to the most doubtful opinions, when once adopted, than I had been highly certain. Imitating in this the example of travellers, who, when they have lost their way in a forest, ought not to wander from side to side, rather to remain in one place, but proceed constantly towards the same side in as straight a line as possible, without changing their direction for the like reason, although perhaps it might chance alone, which first determines the direction. For in this way, if they do not exactly reach the point they desire, they will come, at least in the end, to some place that will probably be preferable to the middle of the forest. In the same way, since in action it frequently happens that no delay is permissible, it is very certain that, when it is not in our power to determine what is true, we ought to act according to what is most probable. And even although we should not remark a greater probability in one opinion than in another, we ought notwithstanding choose one or the other, and afterwards consider it, in so far as it relates to practice, as no longer dubious, but manifestly true and certain, since the reason by which our choice has been determined is itself possessed of these qualities. This principle was sufficient thenceforward to rid me of all those repentings and pangs of remorse that usually disturb the conscience of such feeble and absurd minds as, destitute of any clear and determined principle of choice, allow themselves one day to adopt a course of action as the best, and then the next as the opposite. My third maxim was to endeavour always to conquer myself rather than fortune, and change my desires rather than the order of the world, and in general, accustom myself to the persuasion that, except our own thoughts, there is nothing absolutely in our power, so that when we have done our best things external to us, all wherein we fail of success is to be held, as regards us, absolutely impossible. And this single principle seemed to me sufficient to prevent me from desiring for the future anything which I could not obtain, and such render me contented. For since our will naturally seeks those objects alone which the understanding presents as in some way possible of attainment, it is plain that if we consider all external good as equal beyond our power, we shall no more regret the absence of such goods as seem due to our birth, we deprive them without any faults of ours, and then our not possessing the kingdoms of China and Mexico, and thus making, so to speak, a virtue of necessity. We shall no more desire health and disease, or freedom and imprisonment, than we now do bodies incorruptible as diamonds, or the wings of birds to fly with. I confess, there is need of prolonged discipline, and frequently repeated meditation, to accustom mind to view all objects in this light. I believe that in this chiefly consisted the secret of the power of such philosophers as in former times were able to rise superior to the influence of fortune, and suffering and poverty, enjoy a happiness which their gods might have envied. For, occupied incessantly with the consideration of the limits prescribed to their power by nature, they became so entirely convinced that nothing was at their disposal except their own thoughts, that this conviction was itself sufficient to prevent the entertaining and desire of other objects, and over their thoughts they acquired as well so absolute that they had some ground on this account for esteeming themselves more rich and more powerful, more free and more happy than other men who, whatever be the favour seat on them by nature and fortune, if destitute of this philosophy, can never command the realization of all their desires. Fine, to conclude this code of morals, I thought of reviewing different occupations of men in this life, with a view of making choice of the best, and without wishing to offer any remarks on the employments of others, I may say that it was my conviction that I could not do better than continue in that in which I was engaged, viz., in devoting my whole life to the culture of my reason, and in making the greatest progress I was able in the knowledge of truth, on principles of the method which I had described to myself. This method, for the time I had begun to apply it, had been to me the source of satisfaction so intense as to lead me to believe that more perfect or more innocent could not be endured in this life, and as it means I daily discovered truths that appeared to me of some importance, and of which other men were generally ignorant, the gratification thence arising so occupied my mind that I was wholly indifferent to every other object. Besides, the three preceding maxims were founded singly on the design of continuing the work of self-instruction. First, God has endowed each of us with some light of reason by which to distinguish truth from error. I could not have believed that I ought for a single moment to rest satisfied with the opinions of another, unless I had resolved to exercise my own judgment in examining these whenever I should be duly qualified for the task. Nor could I have proceeded on such opinions without scruple, as I suppose that I should thereby forfeit any advantage for attaining still more accurate, should such exist. And, in fine, I could not have restrained my desires, nor remained satisfied that I had followed a path in which I thought myself certain of attaining all the knowledge to the acquisition of which I was competent, as well as the largest amount of what is truly good, which I could ever hope to secure, inasmuch as we neither seek nor shun any object, except in so far as our understanding represents it as good or bad. All that is necessary to right action is right judgment, and the best action, the most correct judgment, is to the acquisition of all the virtues with all else that is truly valuable and within our reach, and the assurance of such an acquisition cannot fail to render us contented. Having thus provided myself with these maxims, and having placed them in reserve along with the truths of faith which have ever occupied the first place in my belief, I came to the conclusion that I might, with freedom set about, rid myself of what remained of my opinions, and, inasmuch as I hope to be better able successfully to accomplish this work by holding intercourse with mankind, than by remaining longer shut up in the retirement where these thoughts had appeared to me, I took me again to travelling before the winter was well ended. and during the 9 subsequent years I did nothing but roam from one place to another, desirous of being a spectator rather than an actor in plays exhibited on the theatre of the world, and I made it my business in each matter to reflect particularly upon what might fairly be doubted, and prove the source of error. I gradually rooted out from my mind all the errors which had hitherto crept into it. Not that in this I imitated the skeptics, who doubt only that they may doubt, and seek nothing beyond uncertainty itself. For, on the contrary, my design was single to find ground of assurance, and cast aside the loose earth and sand, I might reach the rock or the clay. In this, as appeared to me, I was successful enough. For, since I endeavored to discover the falsehood or incertitude of the propositions I examined, not by feeble conjectures, but by clear and certain reasonings, I met with nothing so doubtful as not to yield some conclusion or adequate certainty, although Mr. Mill's inference that the matter in question contained nothing certain. And just as in pulling down an old house, we usually reserve the ruins to contribute towards their erection, so, in destroying such of my opinions as I judged to be ill-founded, I made a variety of observations that acquired an amount of experience of which I availed myself in the establishment of more certain. And further, I continued to exercise myself in the method I had prescribed, for, besides taking care in general to conduct all my thoughts according to its rules, I reserved some hours from time to time which I expressly devoted to the employment of method in the solution of mathematical difficulties, or even in solution likewise of some questions belonging to other sciences, but which, by my having detached them from such principles of these sciences, is very inadequate certainty, are rendered almost mathematical. The truth of this will be manifest from the numerous examples contained in this volume, and thus, without empirics living otherwise than those who, with no other occupation than that of spending the life agreeably and innocently, study the several pleasure for life, and who, that they may enjoy the leisure without ennui, have recourse to such pursuits as are honourable, but nevertheless prosecuting the design, and making greater progress in the knowledge of truth than I might, perhaps, have made had I been engaged in perusal of books merely, or in holding verse as men of letters. These 9 years passed away, however, before I had come to any determinate judgment respecting the difficulties which form matter of dispute among the learned, or had commenced to see the principles of any philosophy more certain than the vulgar, and the examples of many men of the highest genius, who had in former times engaged in the inquiry, but, as appeared to me, without success, led me to mention it to be a work of so much difficulty that I would not perhaps have ventured on it so soon, had I not heard a kindly rumour that I had already completed the inquiry. I know not what were the grounds of this opinion, and if my conversation contributed in any measure to its rise, this must have happened rather from my having confessed my ignorance with greater freedom than those accustomed to do, who studied a little, and expounded perhaps the reason that led me to doubt of many of those things that by others are esteemed certain, and from my having boasted of any system of philosophy. But I am of a disposition that makes me unwilling to be esteemed different from what I really am. I thought it necessary to endeavour by all means to render myself worthy of the reputation accorded to me. And it is now exactly 8 years since this desire constrained me to remove from all those places where interruption of any of my acquaintances was possible, and take myself to this country, in which the long duration of the war had led to the establishment of such discipline that the armies in pain seemed to be of use only in enabling the inhabitants to enjoy more securely the blessings of peace, and were in the midst of a great crowd actively engaged in business, and more careful with their own affairs than curious about those of others. I have been enabled to live without being deprived of any of the conveniences to be had in the most populous cities, and yet as solitary and as retired as in the midst of the most remote deserts. End of Part 3.
place of which men born deaf and dumb, and thus not less, but rather more than these brutes, destitute of the organs which others use in speaking, are in the habit of spontaneously investing certain signs by which they discover their thoughts to those who, being usually in their company, have leisure to learn their language. And this proves not only that the brutes have less reason than man, but that they have none at all. For we see that very little is required to enable a person to speak, and since a certain inequality of capacity is observable among animals of the same species, as well as among men, and since some are more capable of being instructed than others, it is incredible that the most perfect ape or parrot of its species should not in this be equal to the most stupid infant of its kind, or at least to one that was crack-brained, unless the soul of brutes were of a nature wholly different from ours. And we ought not to confound speech with the natural movements which indicate the passions, and can be imitated by machines as well as manifested by animals. Nor must it be thought with certain of the ancients that the brutes speak, although we do not understand their language. For if such were the case, since they are endowed with many organs analogous to ours, they could as easily communicate their thoughts to us as to their fellows. It is also very worthy to remark that, though there are many animals which manifest more industry than we in certain of their actions, the same animals are yet observed to show none at all in many others. So that the circumstance that they do better, that we does not prove that they are endowed with mind, for it would thence follow that they possess greater reason than any of us, and could surpass us in all things. On the contrary, it rather proves that they are destitute of reason, and that it is nature which acts in them according to the disposition of their organs. Thus it is seen that a clock composed only of wheels and weights can number the hours and measure time more exactly than we with all our skin. I had after this described the reasonable soul, and shown that it could by no means be educed from the power of matter, as the other things of which I had spoken, but that it must be expressly created, and that it is not sufficient that it be lodged in the human body exactly like a pilot in a ship, unless perhaps to move its members, but that it is necessary for it to be joined and united more closely to the body, in order to have sensations and appetites similar to ours, and thus constitute a real man. I here entered, in conclusion, upon the subject of the soul at considerable length, because it is of the greatest moment. For after the error of those who deny the existence of God, an error which I think I have already sufficiently refuted, there is none that is more powerful in leading feeble minds astray from the straight path of virtue than the supposition that the soul of the brutes is of the same nature as our own, and consequently that after this life we have nothing to hope for our fears more than flies and ants, in place of which, when we know how far they differ, we much better comprehend the reasons which establish that the soul is of a nature wholly independent of the body, and that consequently it is not liable to die with the latter, and finally, because no other causes are capable of destroying it, we are naturally led thence to judge that it is immortal. End of Part 5.